Hey guys, who's ready for another tier list? The last one we did cover the melee DPS for Mythic Plus, so this one's going to be focused on the ranged. Don't worry, we're going to be getting to tanks and healers soon, but now let's talk about the ranged. Alright, let's get a few things straight. First off, tier lists are for fun and they're meant to give you a general idea of what's currently performing well. At the end of the day, play what you guys enjoy. However, just understand that if you are playing an off-meta spec or just one that's not performing really well, you might actually struggle to get groups. So in that situation, I'd recommend playing with friends or guildies, or just starting your own groups. Also, I just want to say that before we get into this video, to please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Okay, so like always, let's establish the rankings. So S tier is reserved for specs that are quote-unquote meta specs, and they're going to be the specs that are going to be pushing the highest keys, doing the most DPS, and just overall have the best toolkits for Mythic Plus. A tier is for specs that are performing really well, but they're just not as good as the S tier specs. B tier is for specs that I would say are doing pretty good, and I would say, there's definitely room for improvement. And then C tier is for specs that I would say are probably more like niche, or just, they're just kind of average. And then finally, D is for dog water. I'm kidding, but no, D is for specs that I would say definitely need some major buffs or even reworks. So let's begin. Unfortunately, there are no range specs that I would say are in the S tier. Sorry guys, even as a range player myself, it hurts to say this, but the truth is, Mythic Plus, at least for this season, is super favored towards melee. Starting off with the A tier, we have the Arcane Mage. Arcane has some amazing burst damage both in single target and in lower AoE groups of 4 to 6 targets. Any more than 6 targets, their DPS starts to kind of suffer, and that's why Arcane isn't quite S tier, but it's pretty close. But overall, Arcane's doing really well. They have a ton of defensives like Mirror Image, Prismatic Barrier, Alter Time, Ice Block, Greater Invis. For their utility, Arcane Intellect, Time Warp. They have some really great stuff like Blast Wave, which is a brand new AoE knockback, and it can serve as an AoE interrupt in a pinch. Demo Warlocks shine because they put out some pretty consistent AoE damage, and they have a ton of defensives like Unending Resolve, Demon Skin, and Fell Armor, and they also have some really great sustain with things like Soul Leech. And of course the amazing utility that all Warlocks bring to the table like Lock Rocks, Portals, and Summoning. Marksmanship hunters have some really insane burst, and keep in mind that they're actually losing double tap in the next patch, so their burst is actually going to be affected pretty hard. It's hard to tell whether they're going to be able to make up that damage in the long run or not, but we're just going to have to wait till the next tier list or the next patch to figure that out. They actually do single target damage pretty well, and anything over 3+ targets. However, they do have some pretty weak defensives, and they're pretty squishy. Elemental Shamans are just an all-around great spec to play. They do decent damage and have a really great profile for high burst, all depending on what kind of build they decide to go with their talents. They do some great single target damage and strong mass AoE. And on top of that, they have some great utility with things like Capacitor Totem, an AoE stun, a self-res with Reincarnation, Bloodlust, and of course Earth Elemental, that's going to really help for, hectic moments. There have been quite a few times where I've been in a group where it looks like we're going to wipe, and then, a shaman throws out that Earth Elemental, helps the tank kind of recover, and we stabilize, so that is an awesome spell. So that about wraps up the A tier. Now let's go to the B tier. And starting off, we have the Devastation Invoker. Now, they're actually doing pretty good right now. They have some really great burst DPS, they're really good with mobility, and they have some pretty unique utility. And I forget the name of the spell, but it's the one where, they pop it and it just, resets the cooldown on everyone's movement abilities, which is pretty awesome. On top of that, they can Bloodlust, and they have another awesome spell that can actually cure bleeds, poisons, curses, and diseases called Cauterizing Flame. Oh yeah, and they have a knockback. So if you like playing ranged and also having a ton of utility, that's probably a good spec to try out. Fire Mages have always been a super bursty class to play. They have really short cooldowns, great defensives. However, their main issue is that they're just super gear dependent. They're just one of those specs that just really lives or dies based on balance tuning. And as far as DPS goes, there's just nothing really great about them that I would argue playing them over an Arcane Mage. However, it is worth noting that next patch they are getting some pretty huge buffs, so it might be a reason to play Fire again. Frost Mages is another spec that's suffering from the balance tuning. As far as the DPS goes right now, it's just, Arcane's just doing everything better than them. But besides that, Arcane does put out some pretty consistent AoE, they have a really good funnel, and just like every other mage spec, they have a ton of utility and defensives. Shadow Priests do put out some decent DPS, and just overall, they're a pretty well-rounded spec, aside from the issues that they have. Now, I don't play Shadow that much, but talking to Shadow mains, apparently the playstyle, it just isn't very fun and doesn't flow very well, but if you can get over that, it's a pretty decent spec to play. They have some great utility like Powered Fortitude, and of course the best buff in the game, Powered Infusion. Despite all that, the one big kind of downside to them is their interrupt is really long, and they are not very mobile. Balanced Druids have some really great AoE, and they're one of the few specs that are truly uncapped because of Starfall, which literally hits everything. However, the reason that they're not higher on the list is because the raw DPS they put out just isn't as high as some other specs are. Aside from that, Balanced Druids have tons of utility like Mark of the Wild, Stampeding Roar, Mass Entanglement, Typhoon, Innervate, a combat res, you name it. Basically, if you're looking for a ranged DPS to play and just have a ton of utility to help your group, Boomkins are a great pick. Beast Mastery Hunters have decent single target and AoE. Their damage profile is mostly just like a steady stream of damage. They really don't have any like bursty cooldowns, and they're the only spec in the game that can do their entire rotation while moving, which makes them highly mobile and incredibly unique. However, while recently they did get some new defensives, they're still just incredibly squishy. And I will say, as a Hunter player myself, once you guys do get the 4-piece from your tier set and the bow off the last boss in the Vault of the Incarnates, BM Hunter actually starts to pull higher on the list than MM Hunters. So Affliction Warlocks have some pretty good AoE, and just like all Warlock specs, they have a ton of utility. However, their biggest downfall is that Afflicts currently have some issues with their talent choices. For example, the two flavored builds right now is you either choose between a high single target build or a high AoE build, and you really can't, mix and match them. So you're basically going to be doing either a ton of good AoE and crappy single target, or you're going to be doing a ton of awesome single target and just bad AoE. So that just kind of sucks. And now to finish out this list, we have the Destruction Warlock. Now, they have been nerfed into the ground since Shadowlands. They definitely do some really good single target currently, however, their AoE just is not very good at the moment when compared to the other range specs. The only thing about Destruction is that in AoE, when they do summon their Infernal for DPS, their DPS is actually really good, but the ability itself is just a long cooldown, and when you're waiting for it to come back up, it's just, your DPS just definitely lags from it. Alright, so that should wrap up this video. Hopefully you guys got something out of this one. Thank you so much for checking out my content, and like always, I'll see you guys in the next video.